Men were disappearing along the hog trails. Daniel Conahan was convicted of killing one of them and kidnapping another. He was given the death penalty. After his conviction, the remains of the Fort Myers 8 were discovered. So how many of his victims are still out there? Will he confess in his final hours? We'll all have to wait and see.
Whoa! With our every step, we will shine the light. Together we'll rise, and together we'll fight. We will find the truth with cooking and crime.
This is a long one, so sit back, pop some popcorn, and settle in. And make sure you stick around until the very end for the debut of I Use the Popcorn Button. Welcome back to another episode of Cooking and Crime. I'm Tracy Ellis, and I'm here with my trusty sidekick, Nala Rose. Today, we delve into the Hog Trail murders and the mystery of the Fort Myers 8. Here in southwest Florida, hog trails are nothing unusual. Hogs move through the thick palmettos and undergrowth, creating paths that people can walk through. For generations, local families also hunted these woods for food. But in the 1990s, some of these remote trails and wooded areas became connected to something very different. Men were disappearing, and some of them were being found dead. By the mid-1990s, bodies and skeletal remains were being found in remote areas of southwest Florida. Some were discovered near dirt roads and wooded trails. Others had been hidden so well that time and the Florida wilderness had taken over. At first, these cases did not all appear connected. Some of the men had not even been identified. But investigators were beginning to notice similarities. The victims were men, the locations were isolated, and several of the cases showed signs that these men had not simply wandered into the woods and died. Someone was taking them there. On March 5, 1995, David Payton was walking home from DJ's Bar on US 41 in Fort Myers. It was a blisteringly hot Florida day, and Payton was feeling the effects of the alcohol he had been drinking. He stopped at a roadside bus stop and sat down in the shade to sober up. A blue Mercury Capri pulled over. The driver was Daniel Conahan. Conahan offered Payton beer, and Payton got into the car. As they drove, Conahan offered him money to pose for nude photographs. Payton refused. Then Conahan turned onto an isolated dirt road where the car became stuck in the mud. Payton offered to get out and help push, but Conahan told him to stay behind the wheel and steer. A pickup truck stopped to help pull the Capri out of the mud. While Payton sat there, he looked into the back of the car. He saw a camera, rope, a blue tarp, knives, gloves, and other items, what we might call a murder kit. And suddenly, Payton had a reason to get away, and get away fast. Once the car was free, Payton saw his chance and drove away, leaving Conahan behind. Payton believed he had just escaped something terrible. But Conahan got to the police first. He reported the car stolen. So when police caught up with David Payton, they were not looking for a possible victim. They were looking for a car thief. Payton told them why he had taken the car. He told them about Conahan. He told them about the dirt road. He told them he had been afraid and believed he was getting away from a man who might kill him. But the story went nowhere. Payton kept telling it. He had survived by taking that car, yet he was the one sitting behind bars. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. More than a year passed, and Payton was still in prison with the same story he had been trying to tell from the beginning. Then, in May of 1996, he was watching television. What came across that screen haunted him. Richard Allen Montgomery was 21 years old. On April 16, 1996, Montgomery was with friends when he told them he was going out to make some money and would be back shortly. He had been offered money to pose for nude photographs. Montgomery had also told his mother about the offer and mentioned a man he had recently met. His name was Daniel Conahan. Montgomery left his friends and headed to the meeting point at Cox Lumber in Punta Gorda. Montgomery's roommate testified Richard stated he was going to meet Daniel Conahan. Richard's mother said her son was going to meet a man named Daniel Conahan and had been offered money to pose for nude photographs. Cox Lumber was identified as the meeting point. The trail goes quiet until Richard Montgomery was found the next day, April 17, 1996, in a secluded wooded area. Investigators would have to reconstruct the rest of his final hours through witnesses, records, and physical evidence. The medical examiner determined that Richard had died from ligature strangulation. Let's circle back to David Payton. Remember him? More than a year after he tried to explain what had happened, Payton was still incarcerated. He was serving a state prison sentence for stealing the Mercury Capri, a car that actually belonged to Daniel Conahan's father. By then, Payton was housed at Moore Haven Correctional Facility, well away from Fort Myers and Charlotte County. Then, in May of 1996, after seeing something on television that haunted him, Payton decided to try again. He contacted investigators and told them he believed he knew who was committing the murders in Charlotte County. This time, someone listened. State Attorney Investigator Brian Kelly and Lieutenant John Brock came to Moore Haven to interview him. Payton sat down with investigators and told them the same story he had been trying to tell for more than a year. This time they listened, and there was already a paper trail. Daniel Conahan's name was connected to the stolen Mercury Capri because he had reported the car stolen after Payton escaped in it. Investigators now had Payton's story, the old police report, and a name they could start digging into. On May 9, 1996, they asked Payton to take a polygraph. He agreed, and he passed. Suddenly, Daniel Conahan was no longer just the man Payton had been warning people about. He was becoming a suspect. On August 15, 1994, Stanley Burden was in Fort Myers when he crossed paths with Daniel Conahan near Lyons Park. I know Lyons Park well. I used to play there as a child. The park sat along busy US 41, surrounded by a tall fence and shaded almost completely by large oak trees. The ground was mostly sand and dirt, with metal playground equipment and picnic tables. Burden first encountered Conahan as he was leaving the restroom. Later, near a hamburger restaurant, Conahan approached him again in a light-colored station wagon. This time he made Burden an offer, $100 to $150 to pose for nude photographs. Burden needed the money. He got into the car. Conahan drove Burden past a trucking company and onto a rocky dirt road at the end of Edison Street. They stopped near a secluded grassy area surrounded by melaleuca trees. Conahan took a duffel bag from the car. Inside were a tarp and a camera. The two walked about 15 to 30 feet into the woods, where Conahan spread the tarp on the ground. He began directing Burden as he took Polaroid photographs. Then Conahan pulled out new clothesline-type rope. He said he wanted to take bondage photographs. Burden agreed and stood near a tree. That is when the situation changed. Burden removed his own clothing as directed for the photo session. Conahan positioned him against a tree and began using the rope. Now, the court record gets a little unclear about Burden's exact body position, so I'm not going to guess whether his chest or his back was against that tree. What we do know is that Burden was restrained with rope around his hands, legs, and chest. According to the Florida Supreme Court record, Burden was assaulted while restrained. He resisted. The attack escalated. The rope was tightened, cutting off much of Burden's oxygen, and he struggled to breathe. Conahan eventually gave up and left Burden there, still restrained. Burden was alive. And now he had to get himself free. According to the court record, Burden was somehow able to cut through the ropes and escape. But here is one detail we do not have. The record does not tell us what Burden used to cut himself free, where he found it, or whether something had been left behind by Conahan, intentionally or accidentally. We simply do not know. What we do know is that Stanley Burden got out of those restraints, and then he went looking for help. What did these three men have in common? Richard Montgomery was 21. Stanley Burden was 24. David Payton was 34. All three were relatively young men who were vulnerable and needed money. All three were living in or moving through the Southwest Florida area. Montgomery was offered money to pose for nude photographs. Burden was offered money to pose for nude photographs. Payton was offered beer. The men were offered something that gave Conahan an opportunity to gain their trust. Daniel Conahan's name was beginning to surface from more than one direction. David Payton identified Conahan as the man he said had taken him into the woods. Stanley Burden's earlier report described an attack with striking similarities. Richard Montgomery had told his mother and roommate that he was going to meet a man named Daniel Conahan. Daniel Conahan was no longer simply a man mentioned in an old police report. Three separate stories were beginning to converge on one man. Investigators now had reason to take a much closer look at him. Conahan was born in 1954 and was in his early 40s during the period investigators were examining. So who was Daniel Conahan? Much like Dennis Rader, Conahan did not fit the image most people had of a serial killer. On the surface, he looked ordinary. He had returned to Punta Gorda and was living with his parents. In 1995, Conahan became a licensed practical nurse, graduating at the top of his class from Charlotte Vocational Technical Center. He went to work at Charlotte Regional Medical Center. On a side note, the hospital where Daniel Conahan once worked later became Bayfront Health Punta Gorda and then Shore Point Health Punta Gorda. The building survived Hurricane Ian, but after suffering irrecoverable damage from Hurricanes Helene and Milton in 2024, the hospital was permanently closed. Conahan had a job, a routine, and a life that did not immediately put him on anyone's radar as a suspected serial killer. But by 1996, investigators finally had a reason to start looking much more closely at Daniel Conahan. Conahan was living with his parents in the Paradise area near Peace River Boulevard in Punta Gorda. On the surface, it was an ordinary life. He had a home, he had a family nearby, he had a job as a nurse. Charlotte County covers 858 square miles, and in the 1990s, much of it was far less developed than it is today. Conahan moved through a large area of neighborhoods, businesses, parks, back roads, woods, and isolated places without drawing much attention to himself. By 1996, investigators were beginning to look much more closely at the places he went and the people he approached. One road keeps showing up in this story, US 41. That road runs through the communities that keep coming up again and again in this case: Fort Myers, North Fort Myers, Punta Gorda, Port Charlotte, Northport, Sarasota. And if you know Southwest Florida, then you know those places are not all the same, even if outsiders treat them that way. But US 41 connects them. It helps explain how Conahan moved through this region and how he found vulnerable men along the way. Investigators were no longer relying only on old reports and survivor accounts. They began watching Daniel Conahan. David Payton and Stanley Burden had both described a similar approach: money, photographs, and vulnerable men. Investigators wanted to know whether Conahan was still using that same method. They put an undercover officer in his path and were able to watch Daniel Conahan make the approach themselves. On May 24, 1996, undercover Charlotte County Sheriff's Deputy Scott Clemens encountered Daniel Conahan, where Clemens was propositioned. Investigators wanted to know whether Daniel Conahan was still approaching men. They chose Charlotte County Sheriff's Deputy Scott Clemens for an undercover operation. Clemens was 27 years old and fit the general profile of the young men Conahan had approached. Investigators placed Clemens at Kiwanis Park, a location known at the time to be frequented by gay men. On May 24, 1996, Conahan approached him. Conahan did not know Clemens was a deputy. To him, Clemens was simply another young man he had encountered. This gave investigators something they had not had with Payton, Burden, or Montgomery. This time, law enforcement was watching. They could document what Conahan said, what he offered, and how he approached a man he believed might be willing to go with him. Conahan approached undercover deputy Scott Clemens and began talking with him. During their first encounter, Conahan propositioned Clemens and offered him money for sexual activity. Clemens refused and returned the following day. Conahan approached him again, and this time the conversation turned to photographs. Clemens was offered $150 to pose nude for him. Investigators had already heard similar accounts from the men connected to the case. Now an undercover deputy was hearing the offer directly from Conahan. They were no longer working only with stories from the past. They were watching Daniel Conahan repeat parts of the pattern in real time. The two parted ways. Clemens returned the next day. When Conahan approached him, offered him $150 to pose for nude photographs. David Payton had heard a similar offer. Stanley Burden had heard it too. Now investigators were hearing it directly from Conahan. The undercover operation gave them something they had not had before, a chance to watch the same pattern unfold in real time. Investigators now had 3 separate encounters pointing toward the same method. David Payton had described an offer of money for photographs. Stanley Burden had described a similar offer before being taken into the woods and attacked. Undercover Deputy Scott Clemens had now heard the offer directly from Conahan himself. The stories were lining up. Investigators could now turn their attention to the men who had not survived. One of those men was Richard Allen Montgomery. The undercover operation gave investigators another piece of the puzzle. Their attention was now firmly on Daniel Conahan. There were search warrants issued for Conahan's home and vehicles. They were looking for anything that could connect him to Richard Montgomery's murder and the attack on Stanley Burden. The searches produced physical evidence investigators could begin comparing with evidence already collected in the case. One of the most important connections involved a Mercury Capri belonging to Conahan's father. A tiny piece of physical evidence would now bring that car back into the investigation. A paint chip recovered from Richard Montgomery's body was compared with paint from the Mercury Capri. The paint was found to be indistinguishable. This was the same Mercury Capri David Payton had taken after his encounter with Conahan. Investigators also recovered ropes, cords, cameras, photographs, and other items during searches connected to Conahan. The evidence from Richard's murder could now be examined alongside what investigators had learned from Stanley Burden, David Payton, and the undercover operation. On July 3, 1996, Daniel Conahan was arrested. The investigation that had begun with separate stories from men scattered across southwest Florida was now centered on one suspect. On July 3, 1996, Daniel Conahan was arrested for the attempted murder and kidnapping of Stanley Burden. The investigation into Richard Montgomery's murder continued. On February 25, 1997, Conahan was indicted for the murder and kidnapping of Richard Montgomery. The case took more than 2 years to reach trial. Prosecutors built their case using physical evidence, witness testimony, and the accounts of the men who survived encounters with Conahan. Richard's mother, along with his roommate, told the jury what Richard had said before he disappeared. David Payton and Stanley Burden described their encounters with Conahan. Investigators explained the evidence recovered during the searches and how it connected to Richard. Daniel Conahan went on trial for the murder and kidnapping of Richard Montgomery in 1999. The prosecution presented the physical evidence connecting Richard to the Mercury Capri, along with testimony from the people who knew Richard's plans before he disappeared. David Payton and Stanley Burden gave the jury their accounts of their encounters with Conahan. The jury heard about the offers, the photographs, the secluded areas, and the methods Conahan used. On August 17, 1999, the jury found Daniel Conahan guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The case moved into the penalty phase. The jury recommended a sentence of death. On December 10, 1999, Judge William Blackwell sentenced Daniel Conahan to death for the murder of Richard Allen Montgomery. Nearly 8 years after Daniel Conahan was sentenced to death, a discovery was made in Fort Myers. On March 23, 2007, an ecologist conducting a land survey on a 10-acre property discovered human remains. The Fort Myers Police Department began searching the wooded property. The search eventually uncovered the skeletal remains of 8 men. They became known as the Fort Myers 8. The remains were scattered across the property near a power line corridor and service road. The location raised an immediate question. Stanley Burden had survived Conahan's attack in a secluded wooded area less than a mile from where these 8 men were found. Now, Fort Myers detectives had 8 homicide victims and the difficult task of determining who they were when they died and who killed them. The medical examiner determined that all 8 victims were male. Investigators believed the men had been killed years before their remains were discovered, placing many of the deaths during the same general period as the Hog Trail murders. There were no bullet holes or stab wounds visible on the skeletal remains that could explain how the men died. Investigators considered the possibility that the men had been strangled. There was another connection they could not ignore. Daniel Conahan had been active in southwest Florida during that same period, and Stanley Burden had survived Conahan's attack less than a mile from where the remains were discovered. Fort Myers police identified Daniel Conahan as a person of interest in the deaths of the Fort Myers 8, but Conahan has never been charged with their murders.
In 2026, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a death warrant for Daniel Conahan. Conahan is scheduled to be executed in September 2026. This investigation has involved the work of law enforcement, forensic specialists, and researchers across Southwest Florida and beyond. Recognition goes to the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office, North Port Police Department, Sarasota County Sheriff's Office, Fort Myers Police Department, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and the state attorney's offices that work these cases. Recognition also goes to Parabon Nanolabs, forensic and cold case investigators, and the family members who provided DNA, helping investigators return names to men who remained unidentified for decades.
For viewers unfamiliar with Southwest Florida, there is a way to see this landscape for yourself. Warner Brothers feature film Just Cause, starring Sean Connery, Lawrence Fishburne, and Blair Underwood, was filmed in part at Babcock Ranch in Charlotte County. National Geographic's Path of the Panther also captured this part of Southwest Florida, its wildlife and its natural landscape. And if you want to experience Old Florida for yourself, Babcock Ranch Eco Tours offers a narrated swamp buggy ride through its working cattle ranch and preservation area. The tour takes visitors through woods, wetlands, and ranch land and provides a look at the type of Southwest Florida landscape surrounding the Hog Trail cases. And you may even meet a few of the locals along the way. And now it's time to put away the crime and make some popcorn.
Movie night, I'm set, blanket over my knees. credits rolling gold and let the whole room change. I use the popcorn button. I use the popcorn button. Settle in, get comfy. I'm not moving for nothing. The button. I use the popcorn button. I use the popcorn button. Give me that dramatic scene and the crunch that keeps me company. Paper bags in the drawer, butter on my sleeve. I'm leaning in for every line like it's written just for me. Big twist, small gasp, I'm caught in the frame. Hands full of salted joy while the world goes soft again. I want that slow burn scene. I want the long black fade. Let the credits roll in gold and let the whole room change. I use the popcorn button. I use the popcorn button. Settle in, get comfy. I'm not moving for nothing. Button. I use the popcorn button. I use the popcorn button. Give me that dramatic scene and the crunch that keeps me company. Let it all unfold. Let the moment breathe. I've got the best seat here and a whole night left with me. I use the popcorn button. I use the popcorn button. Settle in, get comfy. I'm not moving for nothing.
Make sure you scan the QR code. It'll take you to my link tree and all the fun things I have there. There's a place for t-shirts. There's a place for my books and just all sorts of things that you can do. So scan that code.
Like and subscribe. It's free.